Hello there. I am glad you could make it today. We are in the book of First Kings, starting in chapter 5. Now, what we have at this point is that Solomon is firmly established as the king of Israel, and as a result of God granting him the gift of wisdom, we find that Solomon is doing very well, and he has quickly advanced Israel to the point where they are a power within their region of the world. They have an alliance with Egypt, and they are secure on their borders, meaning they are not going to war with the countries around them. And in fact, Solomon does have a friend in Hiram, who is the king of Tyre. And Tyre is a city on the Mediterranean Sea and has a lot of land around it. That's in what we now call Lebanon. So, with things being quiet on the international front, Solomon now sets out to build the temple of God. You may know that up until this time, the Ark of the Covenant, which was kind of the center around which uh, worship of God took place, was kept in the tabernacle, a special tent that God had the Israelites build back when they were in the wilderness, or you could say the desert. The ark had stayed there. King David had wanted to build the temple for God, but he had so much blood on his hands as far as all of the fighting and killing that he had done that God said, no, it's going to be for your son to do. But David had arranged some materials ahead of time. Now, Solomon took over this part of it. He got with the king of Tyre, with Hiram, because he needed cedar from the forest of that area. And so he ordered a lot of wood. They came to an agreement where Solomon was really kind of the senior partner in this, but he did work with Hiram, who wanted to do things for Solomon because he had gotten along very well with David. So um, Solomon gathers up a lot of workers and sends them to, one group of them goes to Lebanon to help cut down the trees that are going to be prepared and sent to Israel. Others of them are going to work in stone cutting because the temple itself would be largely stone, even though the wood would go on the inside, and that would then be covered by gold, of which Solomon was getting a lot. In return, Hiram was getting food from Israel because that fulfilled the needs for his people. So everything seemed to be working out okay, and with all of the work that was done, even with a lot of the special skilled labor that was required for the temple, it took 7 years to build. And you think, okay, 7 years is a long time. However, many buildings now with modern machinery take a long time to build. And you think of the great cathedrals of Europe that were built that could easily take 100 years to build, even with the skills that were available then. So this showed that the Israelites, led by Solomon, were really pushing forward with this, and they wanted this temple built. And then after the temple is built, Solomon builds a palace for himself right next to the temple. And you're thinking, okay, that's pretty good too. David apparently had one, but I guess it may have been in a different part of the city, or it had run down. In any event, Solomon has this built, and he is known for wisdom. He is known for the wealth that comes into the country because he also works with Hiram again to have ships built and sent out from the southern part of Israel. And he needed Hiram's help for working with the materials that they had, plus also to have men who were skilled at selling the ships. So you had this going on, and um, Solomon was also collecting a lot of horses and chariots, and this would have been for his military. The chariots being special, you could say, wagons that were pulled by the horses, and they were similar to what we would have today as tanks. So an army with chariots was formidable in battle. So he had that going on. He was known for his wisdom. People came from other countries to ask him questions because they knew that, okay, if we don't know the answers to questions that we've got, then certainly Solomon could answer the questions, and he did. Solomon also knew of all kinds of things. It was counted to him as wisdom, but it's what we would call now knowledge. He knew things about all kinds of animals. He could describe them. He knew essentially how they worked, and that's something that is hard to come by even with a lot of study, but these things came to him naturally and supernaturally because, of course, God had given him these abilities. And all of this kind of came together when the Queen of Sheba came to visit. Now, from all we can tell is that about her is that she came from the south. She had her country in that area, and she had heard much about Solomon, and she came to him with many gifts for him. And having heard about his wisdom, she had a lot of tough questions for him. He was able to answer those without any problem. And she saw that, okay, I'd heard all of these things about you, but they didn't tell half the story. And so she was complimentary with him. She had these um, a great amount. Actually, she gave him tons of gold, and I'm not exaggerating with that. It's something like 4.5 tons of gold that she brought as a gift to him. And uh, Solomon, I guess, was appreciative of that, but he was gaining a lot of gold on his own from the trading that was being done, and it was to the point that people didn't really think much of silver because it wasn't worth as much as the gold was, and it was so common to have gold that that silver wasn't thought of as much, even though now we know of it as a valuable metal, second to gold, and maybe a couple of others that are quite rare. So everything sounds good for Solomon, but let's check in a little bit deeper with this. Now, God had talked to Solomon before, and he talks to him again, and God makes it clear that, yes, this temple that he built was a good thing, and that uh, God would have his eyes and his heart in Jerusalem where his temple was. But God starts hinting at some things. What it turns out is that as nice as the temple was, and as much as God acknowledged that the temple was a fine thing, it was not to contain God, and it was not to, say, buy off God. God still had something he held as much more important, and that was obedience from the people. And when we look closely, we see some things that are kind of bothersome because although it seems like Solomon is doing exactly what God wants, we see that, wait a second, his alliance with Egypt, you kind of wonder about that because there had been problems with Egyptians before, and the alliance came about from him marrying the daughter of Pharaoh. You go, he's not supposed to be marrying foreign women. Oh, and this thing with the horses and chariots, God had told the Israelites a long time before that you are just to have infantry, the soldiers on foot. You're not supposed to collect horses and chariots, and Solomon had done that. Also, God had said you're not supposed to, to hoard gold and silver and valuable things. He saw people as more important, and yet Solomon has been gathering a lot of these things. And one of the things that Solomon did Well, in working with Hiram, kind of as a reward to Hiram, he gave Hiram, king of Tyre, 20 of his towns and cities. And then when Hiram went to look at them, these were worthless towns. They were really a burden on Hiram. It wasn't a nice gift. Hiram had done some great things for Solomon and the Israelites, and yet this is how he is rewarded for his kindness and friendship. Um, Now, one of the things I should add in this is that the workers who had been sent to Lebanon to cut the trees and get them sent back to Israel were not Israelites. They were the remnants of the tribes that the Israelites were supposed to have driven out of the promised land, yet they were still there. Although they were forced to do this labor, still Solomon had not followed through and driven them out. And so we're seeing that thing after thing after thing that Solomon's doing is a problem. And maybe the worst of it was that he spent more time building his palace than he had the temple of God. And apparently, well, it was larger than God's temple. And apparently, he spent more on that. And so, as many things as Solomon did that were good, he is showing that um, God is not his priority. And God had warned him the second time they talked to him that, if the people fall away from me, and a lot of that is determined by how the king leads the people, then that temple would become a ruin, and then people would think about it and go, ooh, that's a sad reminder of a people who failed to follow God. So what we see in all of this is that God has followed through on his promises to keep Israel free from war during the time of Solomon and to enrich Solomon for the wisdom for which he had requested and everything else. But Solomon is not treating those gifts with the proper respect, and he is definitely starting to turn his head and his vision away from pleasing God. So we see the roots, the seeds of problems that are going to start occurring with Israel. And it will only be a matter of time before we see the effects of this. Because as people fall away from God, God doesn't usually um, punish the people right away. He gives them time to come back. But at the point where they decide they're not coming back and God sees for himself it's not going to happen, then the punishment will follow. And so that's a warning to us that if things are going well for us, that's the time we need to focus the most on God. Okay, with that, I'm going to close this story. Today's tie is a tie of gold to remind us of all the gold that Solomon was able to accumulate, and also a reminder to us to use our gold, meaning our money, our resources, for things of God. Okay, with that, I will let you go, and I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye.